title of my sermon is Considering the Long Term. And I want to talk about how to balance our thinking between short and long term. But this is not an investment talk. We're going to be talking about that in the context of religion and ethics. Specifically, I want to talk about how properly to frame our moral thinking. How do our expectations of the future shape our ethical behavior in the present? And what is the window of our moral concern? When we decide about acting in one way or another, how far down the line should we consider the consequences of our actions? You'll see why I'm thinking about these questions in a moment, but let me just talk about the way that I think we normally have this kind of temporal perspective when we make decisions. I think it's shaped something like a saddle. So the center of our moral concern is the present. And then if you think about the sides of the saddle, there's the recent past and the near future. And further down the saddle, we sort of gesture towards the distant past and maybe towards the far future. As we interact with the people and things around us, we give greatest attention to what's here and now. For example, we prefer not to, we consider the preferences of the people who came before us, and we prefer not to demolish certain historic buildings out of respect for their historical or ancestral significance. We also evaluate the effects of our actions on the future, avoiding behavior that could, for example, permanently damage the environment or on a personal level, injure our future health. But for most of us, we give the greatest weight to the contemporary effect of our actions. That is, we care the most about how our actions shape ourselves, our families, and our communities right now. As Christians, the New Testament shapes our temporal perspective. But in what way? As contemporary Christians, we tend to think of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ that we've been hearing about, this is the Easter theme, as the central event in history. Do you all think about it that way? I mean, there's AD and BC and AD, and in between, there's Jesus's birth, death, and resurrection. It's a dividing line of history. And roughly, we have kind of recorded history for about equal periods on both sides, right? So, for example, if you go back a few millennia, the pyramids of Giza were built around 2500 BC, and the Epic of Gilgamesh was composed around 2100 BC. And so it makes sense for us to consider the birth of Jesus as the middle of history, at least as the middle of recorded history, looking back as we do from a vantage point now 2,000 years later. You can sort of see that there's a window on both sides, right? But the writers of the New Testament did not see things that way at all. The writers of the New Testament saw the advent of the Messiah not as the center of history, but as the end of history. As we read, or as Steve read for us in 1 Peter 1:20, quote, "He was destined before the foundation of the world, but was revealed at the end of the ages for your sake." In other words, the writers of the New Testament, at least Paul and the authors of the Gospels, considered that they lived at the very end of history. So the conceptual challenge that poses for us is reconciling the early Christians' understanding that the resurrection of Christ signaled the end of history with the ongoing existence of the world. I mean, here we are 2,000 years later. History seems to be continuing apace, so it's hard to say that history ended when Jesus was resurrected. For the first generations of Christians, it would have been impossible to imagine that history would have continued to unfold 2 millennia after the resurrection of Christ. The common conviction of the early church was that the resurrection of Jesus signaled the beginning of the end. His death meant that everyone would rise within a matter of what? People's lifetimes. They didn't expect that it would continue much longer than, maybe a few decades. So there was no point speculating about consequences of our actions or of their actions in a far-off future. So the ethics of the New Testament reflect this temporal perspective. Paul, for example, counsels members of his community to avoid marriage and elevates singleness over family life. Why does he do that? Well, if the world is ending, why bother getting married and having kids? That makes zero sense. So the foreshortened temporal perspective also clarifies Paul's otherwise perplexing quiescence towards slavery in Philemon and tyranny. Why lead a social or political revolution when Christ will come to end history altogether and judge the world in his own righteous terms? Now, the tendency to foreground the present has persisted among Christians even after the church gave up its expectations of an immediate end to the world. Now, just take here one example from the literature. As Christian Poole, a professor of English at the University of Delaware, writes in a recent book called Christianity in a Time of Climate Change, To Give a Future with Hope, quote, thinking about futurity, about the future human beings who are our neighbors, is not a strength of Christian theology. The first Christians expected the imminent return of Christ. And so thinking about an ethical responsibility towards the human beings who would live in 10, 100, or 1,000 years into the future was theologically moot, even absurd. According to Poole, the intervening 2,000 years of history have largely failed to correct this tendency towards presentism in Christian ethical thinking. She writes, modern ethical concerns have been focused on social justice for those in the present or on the immediate fate of the unborn. She remarks with an eye to the right and left wings of our church, but not on social justice for the generations of the unborn. However, there is a burgeoning philosophical movement called long-termism that aspires to correct what it regards as our myopia about the fate of future generations. William MacAskill, a philosopher at Oxford University, is a leader of this nascent movement, and in 2022, he published a book called What We Owe to the Future. And in this book, he contended that we need to give far greater weight to future generations in our ethical decision-making. As he puts it, long-termism is based on the ideas that future people have equal moral worth, and that there could be very large numbers of future people, and that what we do today can affect how well or poorly their lives go. MacAskill uses a simple thought experiment to motivate his concern for long-termism. This is his quotation. Suppose that, while hiking, I drop a glass bottle in the trail and it shatters. And suppose that, if I don't clean it up, later a child will cut herself badly on the shards. In deciding whether to clean it up, does it matter when the child will cut herself? Should I care whether it's a week or a decade or a century from now? What do you all think?
Millions.
The straightforward response to MacAskill's rhetorical question, I think, is that we should care about potential future harm whenever it occurs. That is, harm to someone yet unborn matters too. Now, extrapolating from this experiment, MacAskill argues that we also need to take harm to future generations seriously. How can we take actions now to mitigate harm to those who will come after us? Like any work of philosophy, MacAskill's book is complex and multifaceted, and while I don't agree with everything that he writes, I do recommend it as a book worth reading. As with any form of prognostication, thinking about the ethical demands that countless generations may have on us, countless generations yet to come may have on us, is difficult, and drawing out the practical implications for our behavior today can prove equally challenging. MacAskill himself noted that while he wrote the book, he changed his mind several times on key issues. So what I want to do today is to articulate a few of my own worries about putting too much stress on the long term. While I'm not advocating for short-term thinking, I do think that the New Testament author's faith in Jesus as being at the end of history should temper any Christian version of long-termism. So let me just give a few thoughts about how to balance the New Testament's perspective on the present with our ethical concerns for the future. So one is, a problem with thinking about the long term is that we as individuals lack the agency to control what happens in the future. Facing a problem without having the means to address it yourself gives rise to anxiety. And one of the things that I think about is we have to be careful about teaching children about the potentially catastrophic events that may happen in the future. Because if we're not careful, we may wind up fostering more fear and anxiety than motivating them to positive social and political action. I'll just give an anecdote from my own life. When I was growing up in the 1980s, we learned in elementary school about the existential threat of nuclear war. We didn't practice hiding under our desks or running for fallout shelters because, as scientists like Carl Sagan warned, there'd be no way to survive the nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And if you did survive the immediate destruction, you probably wouldn't make it through the nuclear winter that followed. Now, do you all remember this show in 1983 called The Day After, broadcast on ABC? You do, yeah. I mean, it was a big event at the time, and it was still, I think, in the record books as the most watched movie on broadcast television. But The Day After was an imaginary film about what life would look like after a full-scale nuclear war. And it's no spoiler to say it looked pretty bleak. Like everyone of my generation, I gathered around with my parents and my grandparents to watch this movie and absorb the horror of what would come to pass if there were this nuclear exchange. So the problem there, though, is what could I do about this? How could I prevent this? It was, in a sense, a kind of future that was awful, but there was nothing, at least as a young child, that I could do. And I worried that an analogous anxiety pervades the current generation as they think about contemporary challenges like climate change, global pandemics, or maybe runaway artificial intelligence. To be clear, I have no doubt that our climate is changing, that we may experience other pandemics, and that artificial intelligence has potential to cause harm. But fostering fear about the future carries its own risks. We all know Franklin Delano Roosevelt's caution in his 1933 inaugural address that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Now, strictly speaking, what Roosevelt said isn't true. We have other things to fear, like an asteroid smashing into Earth. But Roosevelt identified a genuine threat, namely that there is a social contagion that is associated with fear, which can be equally devastating as other threats. So when teaching children about climate change, we don't want them to just become fearful and despairing. I worry that a lot of kids these days suffer from anxiety about the future, and we see that deaths of despair, whether caused by drug use or other types of actions, are on the rise. What causes this generational anxiety, I think, is complex, but fear about the future and the inability to do anything about it, I think, plays a significant role. So when teaching about climate change, nuclear proliferation, runaway artificial intelligence, and the like, we also need to teach children about stories of human resilience. Humanity has proved adaptable in the face of global challenges. For example, our ability to create vaccines at the beginning of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic provides a shining illustration of our capacity to find solutions to our most pressing and social and political problems. And coming back to the New Testament, we also need to think about helping children to understand that history just isn't autonomous, running on its own, but there is a divine being who looks upon us in that history and is guiding it towards positive ends. In the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus warned against fretting about the future. He said, "So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today." As followers of Jesus, I think we are called not to worry about the future, but to have confidence that God is acting in the future. On a personal level, I would say worry is not really all that productive. Personally speaking, I'm no stranger to worries about the future. It's easy to take a problem that we experience today and through our imagination, extrapolate to the worst case scenarios. But catastrophizing generally doesn't produce useful results for the present. When reflecting on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we find that their underlying ideas are a confidence in God's goodness and mercy towards us. We gain confidence that we may face present challenges and future ones with hope rather than anxiety because of that benevolence. As a church, I think we have an obligation to share this confidence, this hope, and this faithful optimism with the current generation of young people who I think are suffering from a kind of future anxiety. And that's true both here on the island and elsewhere. So personal confidence about the future doesn't come just from learning examples of human resilience under pressure, but also learning to rely on God's providential guidance in our lives. There's a reason that we've taught kids in Sunday school to sing, "He's got the whole world in his hands." Now, on a social and political level, where we do at least arguably have the collective power to tackle some of the major threats to our future, we also suffer from what I would term epistemic uncertainty. In other words, we may focus on solving a problem that turns out to actually be the wrong problem. And I think we've seen this many times in history, so we need to be careful about this. In 1980, for example, China adopted its so-called one-child policy to curb what it considered its major threat of population growth. And this draconian policy imposed strict limits on family size, infringing personal freedom, and causing immense sorrow and suffering. Ironically, the problem in China now is a rapidly aging population. After 2013, China dropped the one-child policy, but it may be too late to reverse the trend towards population decline. So by taking drastic action to prevent what the Chinese government perceived as a threat to its future, they may have inadvertently brought about another threat. That's what I mean by epistemic uncertainty. We can't always know the right way to act about the future in the present. So that's not to say that we should shirk addressing the major challenges that McCaskill enumerates in his book. And I've already mentioned them: climate change, nuclear catastrophe, bioengineered plagues, artificial intelligence that takes over and starts trying to run the world on its own, and more. We can and should work to mitigate these challenges to human existence. But as Christians, we have to do so on the basis that we believe the future is ultimately in God's hands. Coming back to the perspective of the early Christians, we share this faith in the providential care of the Spirit. We may not expect the imminent return of Jesus in the same way as they did. As a Christian community, we, of course, celebrate marriages and births. I hear that we have one to celebrate in our midst just this very week because Will and Diana Fisk have welcomed a new baby into their family. So that is something to celebrate. And we rejoice in the intergenerational ministries that bind us together across age groups. The Pauline preference for celibacy has basically fallen away, sometimes even to the extent that single adults feel unwelcome in church, and we need to make sure that that's not true. But what we have in common with the early church is the conviction that Jesus Christ stands at the end of history, beckoning us toward a renewed world of justice, holiness, and peace. So how, in the end, do we navigate between political quiescence and social engineering, if you want to see those as twin dangers? Answering this question is not easy. So I'll just share a few thoughts about how we can move forward. First, we should remember to read the Pauline letters and the Gospels in the context of the Bible as a whole. In the Old Testament, for example, we do find an ethics of care for future generations. And so we need to respect the multiplicity of the Bible as it helps us to rebalance our perspective on the future. If we only read the New Testament, we'll inevitably incline towards presentism. But I don't think that's true of the Bible as a whole. And second, let's avoid apocalyptic thinking in the present. There are strands of Christianity that continue to seek signs that the end of the world is nigh. I think we could probably all find examples of that, from Harold Camping on to others, Jim Jones and others, but they don't usually turn out very well. By chasing the apocalypse, these Christians narrow their temporal perspective to the present and ignore the needs of the future. At its worst, they disregard obvious harm to coming generations, polluting the earth and exhausting natural resources with wanton abandon because the earth isn't going to last long anyway. So we need to make sure that we avoid that type of apocalyptic thinking in our own lives. Finally, let us adopt an optimistic and humble attitude toward the time that remains, relying on God's providential guidance to carry us through what seems like the insurmountable challenges of the present. As I said, worrying too much about what lies ahead is counterproductive and paradoxically may cause us to lose hope in the future. As Christians, we rely on God's guidance in daily scripture reading, in prayer, in communal worship to help us find the solutions to our most vexing problems. So, the last thing that I think we could do is also to find ways that we can make small but positive differences in the world. All of us can take these kind of small but significant actions to improve the future, keeping the future in mind. And as I've said earlier, I think we have a special duty to provide young people who are exposed to so much negative news and thus prone to anxiety with ways to address these challenges in a practical and fruitful manner. So I'm happy that Union Chapel has committed to building a media lab for good to give the young people on the island an opportunity to engage their peers worldwide. The Media Lab will provide an outlet for the creativity of young people and for the adults who mentor them to craft and share messages of love, faith, and hope with the idea of making the world a better place. As Christians, we do not know precisely where history is leading us. We do not know how long God will delay the end of the world. We do not know how to address not only the present, but also of the future. He is the Lord not only of this generation, but of all generations to come. And in that, we may take hope. Amen.